So in this video, we're going to look at the revenue sources and what drives revenue in the major North American sports. So in general, just as with a lot of other industries, revenue is driven by demand. The more demand there is for the product, the more revenue is brought in by that product. So when you talk about revenue, the price of the good does play a role. So some of the factors that impact revenue, price is one. You have that downward sloping demand. As price goes up, the quantity demand goes down. As price goes down, quantity demand goes up. With sports, you also have the price or availability of substitutes. And when you talk about substitutes, so for example with the Phillies, substitutes for the Phillies would be other sports teams like the Eagles, 76ers, and the Flyers, as well as other smaller teams like the Philadelphia Union. But going to sports games is a form of entertainment, and so other substitutes for going to sporting events is things like going to the movies, going to concerts. Okay, so other entertainment options. Something else that affects revenue is the price or availability of compliments. So when you go to a Phillies game or an Eagles game, you're not just paying for that ticket, you also have to pay for things that go along with going to the game, which is parking, concessions, after event entertainment. Okay. So these are all compliments, things that you buy with the tickets. You also have consumer income. So you have normal goods and inferior goods. Normal goods are goods that you buy more of as you have more income, and inferior goods are goods that you buy less of when you have more income. Okay. For the most part, sporting events are normal goods. So the more income people have, the more likely they are to go to sporting events. Number of consumers is something else that affects revenue. The more demand there is, the more revenue you have. And so the number of consumers could depend on market size, but it could also depend on tastes and preferences. So for example, day of the week. There's more demand for games on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday than there are Monday through Thursday. The quality of the teams. Higher quality, or games between higher quality opponents tends to have more demand and more revenue. The importance of the game, the competitiveness of the game, weather, if there's any star players, these all factor into the number of consumers that want to go to the game. So, looking at just the cost side for a second, cost in sports are driven by the cost of talent. All right. So salaries that are paid to players makes up a big part of the cost. So if you look at the cost, you have fixed costs and you have variable costs. Some of the fixed costs that teams face are, again, salary, but also advertising, travel, venue-related costs. But then you have the variable costs, which are things like game day staffing, such as ushers and food vendors. So if we compare revenue to cost, this table gives just kind of a broad overview as of 2016 of the market values of the teams, the revenue they bring in, the payroll they have, gate revenue, and also operating income. So if you look at baseball, and this is organized by operating income, so profit, you can see that there is a pretty wide dispersion between the ones at the top. So for example, San Francisco made a profit of $72.6 million, whereas the Dodgers took a loss of $73.2. The NBA, one thing you'll notice that in particular with the NBA and the NHL and the NFL, and we'll talk about why that is in a minute, the payrolls in these are relatively similar. Okay? So because of that, a lot of the profit is directly linked to revenue. So in baseball, you can see that, for example, the Dodgers have a high amount of revenue, but because their payroll is so high, they have a loss there. Then you have, basketball. You have relatively similar payrolls, and that's where you're going to see the high revenue teams are also the high profit ones. Same with hockey, football, and soccer is a little bit of a combination. So professional teams, especially in North America, generate revenue from 6 sources. So you have ticket or gate revenue, national and local broadcasting rights, advanced media such as streaming, licensing revenue, other venue-related items, luxury boxes, concessions, naming rights, and revenue sharing or transfer from other teams, which we'll talk about all these individually. So the total revenue is equal to the revenue from gates plus the revenue from broadcasting, revenue from other media, revenue from licensing, other venue-related, and transfers. Okay, so this is the formula of revenue that a team, the formula for revenue that a team collects. Now, this is very important. Some leagues are much more profitable than others. So in football, for example, the NFL, the median operating income was $76 million. Right? Baseball, the median was $21 million. And so you see a pretty big difference there. We'll talk more about that. So let's look at gate revenue first. Okay. So gate revenue is the money that people pay for tickets for the game. So this ranks from the highest revenue teams down to the lowest. And so, for all of these, Major League Baseball, NHL, NBA, NFL, you have, the top revenue capturer, which team brings in the most revenue, all right, for each of these. And then who brings in the second most and how much they bring in and so forth. All right. So the biggest thing to note here is that the most popular baseball team generates most of the gate revenue and by a large amount, and then it drops off very quickly. Whereas Major League Baseball has the largest variation between teams when it comes to gate revenue. With the NFL, however, because there's fewer games and most of the games sell out, what you see is the smallest amount of variation with that. Okay, so you can see the teams in the NFL, they all make, as far as gate revenue, a relatively high amount, and it doesn't go down much. So broadcasting revenue. The value of television rights really varies from sport to sport. With the NFL, much of the value to teams comes from broadcasting rights. All right, the rights that different stations have to broadcast their games. A lot of Major League Baseball, National Hockey League, and NBA contracts are local, so the value is more individualized. With the NFL, however, all games are part of national packages, which means that whenever a game is on, it can be shown in any part of the country. Whereas with the other sports, a lot of times those games are only shown in the local market. Okay. And so what happens with football is, for the most part, the broadcasting revenue gets split between all the teams. Okay. Major League Baseball, the teams have local contracts in addition to national. But the difference is very large. And so, for example, the Dodgers, they make $204 million in local broadcasting rights, but the Marlins and Rockies only make 20. With the NBA basketball, they get about $2.66 billion that is shared from contracts with ABC and ESPN and TNT, but they also get local revenue as well. All right. But there is revenue sharing of even that local. The NHL, much of the disparity in the values of teams in the NHL comes from the difference in contracts, which is the difference in broadcasting contracts, which is mostly local. Now, there does exist substitution between going to games and watching them on TV. And so, if people are watching games on TV, they're not going to go to the stadium to watch it. And this has become a problem in the NFL at times for teams that are more small market or not performing well. And so what teams have done to kind of help to prevent this is have what are called blackout games. And with these, the rules in the NFL are if the game doesn't get sold out, they don't show it on TV. And this was a big problem, especially with the Detroit Lions for a bunch of years, where they, each week it wouldn't be known if the game was going to be on TV or not because they weren't selling out the games. So as technology has evolved, advanced media options have become an alternate way to view games as opposed to traditional cable. Baseball has been streaming games to YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter over the past few years. The NFL has recently began streaming games on Amazon Prime. And as this different streaming services continue to become more popular, this is going to become a larger part of the team's revenue. So the other thing is licensing. The four major leagues have licensing arms that oversee the sales of official team paraphernalia. So it's not individual teams making the sales, it is more the overall league that controls that. And so the reason why they do that is they're able to better centralize the negotiation, which allows them to get a better deal for it. Now, the NFL has gone away from that in recent years. Jerry Jones, when he bought the team in 1989, he decided to sign a licensing agreement with deals with Pepsi and Nike, which were not part of the overall licensing agreements at the NFL. The NFL did try to block this, but was unsuccessful. And so the Cowboys and some other teams have gone on to negotiate their own licensing agreements. So this has been changing. Luxury boxes. So with luxury boxes, a lot of times, if you go to a game, especially a football game, you have these luxury boxes. They're not just normal seats. They're seats, but it's also, they'll have food up there. You're separated from other fans. Now, when that happens, the revenue gets split between concessions and the actual value of the ticket. So, for example, the Dallas Cowboys, they have luxury boxes that sell for between $224,000 and $900,000 per season. Now, only a small portion of that goes towards the actual sale of the seat, whereas the rest of it goes towards concessions. Now, why is that important? It's important because the ticket revenue gets shared among all the teams, but the concession revenue does not. And so this was Jerry Jones's way of kind of getting around the revenue sharing, which is why you talk about the value of teams. The Dallas Cowboys are always at the top or near the top of the most valuable franchises. The other thing is sponsorships. This can be on uniform or equipment. This can be on the team or league level. And stadium naming rights are also huge. And here is just a broad overview of some of the value of the naming rights that are there. As of 2016, MetLife Stadium, the Giants and Jets Stadium, sponsored by MetLife, the deal was for $450 million over 25 years, which is an average of $18 million a year. So this is all money that teams have coming into them simply by the company being able to advertise their name as the name of the stadium. So the other part of the revenue is revenue sharing. So all leagues have some sort of revenue sharing. The NFL, in early years, a lot of NFL teams folded or relocated. And this is because the small market teams had a difficult time keeping up with their competitors. And this led to the league deciding that the only way for them to proceed was to sharing gate revenue. And so the way that it works with the NFL is teams only keep 60% of the gate revenue, and the rest is spread out among all the teams. Now this helps the NFL teams that have, with the higher market teams, the bigger teams that have more ticket revenue, it helps them share their value with the other lower market teams, smaller market teams, who wouldn't be able to do that. The NFL also has equal sharing of things like television rights, advanced media, licensing revenue. And as I mentioned, the luxury boxes are what really separates the values of the teams. With the NHL, the National League, the TV revenue is shared. So if you look at the NHL, the national broadcasting rights, the money from that is shared between all teams, whereas the local is not. Now, the sharing factor is more of a complicated formula, and it depends on different factors that are more team specific. With the NBA, each team contributes 50% of their total revenue into a pool, and then teams can be net gainers or payers depending on how much the revenue is versus their payroll. And then with baseball, teams pay 30% of their net local revenue that is paid to each team equally. So what this essentially does is it transferred money from the larger market teams to the smaller market teams. And so that's just a relatively brief overview of the revenue in the 4 major North American sports.